see if there are questions. You are welcome to do so. Please note that this is recorded. And stay on mute unless you have a question for Alison. It saves a lot of background noises. So without further ado, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. And over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Philo, and thank you, Tim, for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm really happy to be here to speak to PA West on safe sport. Just before I start the presentation, just a little introduction. I'm, as Philo said, Alison Kocoras. I'm the Safe Sport Administrator for U.S. Soccer, and I started in this job just about a year ago. It's a new position that U.S. Soccer created to help with the response and resolution of safe sport complaints, and also to be a resource to our members in administering their own safe sport programs. So I have a long history with the Federation. I first worked at U.S. Soccer back in the early 2000s as the staff attorney and then as the general counsel. And then I left and came back as the director of human resources for a few years and left again for 10 years. And I'm just now back this past year, and I'm thrilled to be back. I'm a lawyer by trade, but I have been involved in soccer my whole life. I played Division I college soccer, and I coached one season as the assistant coach for the Loyola University Chicago women's soccer team when I was in law school. And so this safe sport is really important to me because I had such a fantastic experience coming up through Illinois youth soccer. And I really am dedicated to trying to make the experience for our players all across the country a good one and a positive one. So I appreciate your time tonight. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I was planning to save questions till the end. I want to make sure I get through the presentation fairly quickly because I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for feedback and if you have questions. So I think I'll do that, but certainly, you know, I can answer any questions that you have about the presentation in full after it's over. So let's see if I can manage to figure this out. Let's see. Okay, hopefully you all are seeing my cover page here. So just very quickly, just a disclaimer, you can't give legal advice, and this is just a general presentation for informational purposes, but you can certainly follow up with your state association if you have specific questions about certain circumstances in your membership. Quickly, an agenda. I wanted to just go over the Safe Sport Act. This is probably old news to all of you, but I wanted to cover really quickly what the Act does. And then I think the most important part of the presentation is covering reporting obligations, because really making sure you know when you have to make a report is really the best way that our sport has to stop abuse. And so we'll talk about reporting obligations, and then I have dealt with several scenarios over the course of the last year that I think are helpful in illustrating what type of conduct requires a safe sport report. And so I thought I'd go through some examples of real world situations that I've faced, that U.S. Soccer has faced over the past year, to sort of paint a picture of the type of conduct that requires a report. And then finally, I thought we could cover the Center for Safe Sports 2022 minor athlete abuse prevention policies, and then just kind of a general overview of prevention policies and what U.S. Soccer expects of its members and what the center will expect of state associations in 2022 when the center extends its jurisdiction to our state associations. And then, like I said, I think I can get through this in probably 20-25 minutes, and I would love to use the rest of the time to answer any questions you have about reporting, about safe sport. And once again, thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak tonight. So this is just a slide that summarizes the Safe Sport Act. In 2018, the federal government passed the Safe Sport Act, and really the federal law that was passed in 2018, it does two things. The first thing it did was that it expanded the categories for mandatory reporters, which in the past, mandatory reporters have been doctors, teachers, therapists. Basically, the Safe Sport Act expanded mandatory reporter to include any adult participant in the Olympic movement. So any adult participant in any Olympic sport is now under federal law a mandatory reporter. That means I am, any coaches, referees, employees of state associations, board members, anybody that's participating in soccer, in U.S. soccer, is a mandatory reporter. The second big thing that the Safe Sport Act did was to create the U.S. Center for Safe Sport, which is an organization that has jurisdiction over U.S. soccer and its participants with regard to some amateur athlete safety issues. And I can cover those. When we talk about reporting, I can discuss which types of complaints the Center for Safe Sport has jurisdiction over when it comes to U.S. soccer and its members. So reporting requirements. I'm really trying hard to help make sure that everyone is educated about, when you need to make a report. So the easiest way to explain it: who, what, when, where. Any adult participating with U.S. soccer or any of its members, U.S. club soccer, AYSO, any of its members is required to make a report as a mandatory reporter for certain types of misconduct if they hear allegations. Any allegation of child abuse or sexual misconduct requires a report. And the important thing to remember here is that it's the allegation that triggers the reporting requirement. You don't have to verify the complaint. You don't have to investigate to figure out if the person who's making the allegations is telling the truth. Anytime that you hear about an allegation of child abuse or sexual misconduct, it has to be reported. And investigation, that's the follow-up, but the report happens first. And it has to be made as soon as possible, which the Center for Safe Sport has told U.S. Soccer means within a 24-hour period. So if you have a player or a coach, someone complain to you about child abuse or sexual misconduct, within 24 hours, you need to make that report. Child abuse has to be reported both to local law enforcement, which would be like the local police, or possibly the Department of Child and Family Services in your state, if it's like a parent issue, and also to the Center for Safe Sport. Sexual misconduct, which is just, sexual misconduct, if it doesn't involve a child, that still needs to be reported to the Center for Safe Sport. So those are the two types of conduct that trigger the reporting requirement under the Safe Sport Act. And I'll show you some examples. We can discuss some examples that kind of better illustrate what that behavior might look like, and some of the less obvious forms that it takes. I just also included the link to the Center for Safe Sports reporting page. There's a really easy way to file an online report. It's a web form that just asks for all of the information that you have. And when you make a report, it's just important to remember to provide whatever information you have. Often when we get allegations about these types of, about misconduct like this, we don't have complete information. We might not know the name of the accused. We might not know the name of the victim. The important thing is that we notify law enforcement and the center when required and provide whatever information that we have, even if it's incomplete. This slide just talks about the definition of child abuse. And again, it'll be easier to understand once we go through some of the scenarios that we dealt with over the past year. I mean, some of these categories are pretty obvious. Obviously, any sexual abuse of a child or physical mistreatment of a child constitutes child abuse. But you can also have mental child abuse, and that can be tricky to figure out whether mental emotional misconduct rises to the level of child abuse, where you would be required to make a law enforcement report or make a Center for Safe Sport report. So the definition of mental injury there, just want to draw your attention to that. Essentially, mental child abuse is conduct that goes beyond just sort of your run-of-the-mill bullying behavior. It means that a child's psychological or intellectual functioning has been harmed. That's the definition. And the things to look for in trying to figure out whether a child has been mentally abused are, anxiety, depression, aggressive behavior, eating, sleeping disorders, or if if the conduct that is alleged is sort of ongoing, pervasive, super severe, happening all the time, and the child involved is really showing, consequences of that behavior, it can constitute mental child abuse. And I have an example that I'll discuss to help illustrate that. But if you're hearing a complaint from somebody and you do think it rises to this level of mental injury, it also needs to be reported to law enforcement and the Center for Safe Sport, just as if the allegation was for physical child abuse. Sexual misconduct. Again, some of these categories are sort of obvious, but any sexual harassment or gender-related harassment, any sort of non-consensual sexual contact or attempts to make contact, even if they're unsuccessful, and any exploitation, unauthorized photography or video, posting private activity, or exposing someone to sexually explicit imagery, all without their consent. All of those behaviors are sexual misconduct. Sending sexually explicit texts or material, unwanted material. And the thing to remember about sexual misconduct is actually, I've had this question a bunch over the past year. Even if the people involved are both adults, you still have to make a report to the center if sexual misconduct is alleged. If a child is involved, it also has to be reported to law enforcement. But any sexual misconduct, even if it's between two adult coaches or two adult referees, that has to be reported to the Center for Safe Sport. Okay, this is I think the most interesting part of my presentation. These are all examples that I helped members deal with over the past year. And, some of them happen more than once. And so I thought each of these sort of teaches that, it helps to show the type of behavior that needs to be reported under the Safe Sport Act. This first example, unfortunately, I actually had this situation probably half a dozen times last year. And I can see this happening a lot, because this is, one part of a coach's job is to check in with players at practice. And so this happened a couple of times, this first example, where a player ends up divulging to a coach at practice that he's being abused at home, either, that his father hit him was one of the cases that I dealt with. And really what happened is at practice, the player, is off or distracted or seems angry or withdrawn. And like any good coach, the coach says, hey, pulls them aside and says, what's going on? Are you okay? You're kind of out of it. A player ends up making this kind of confession. This is conduct that has to be reported to law enforcement. It's alleged child abuse. The thing that's a little tricky about a situation like this is that sometimes they think, well, this has nothing to do with soccer. This is happening at home. The dad's not registered. The dad's not, in our organization. Those are all sort of jurisdictional issues that are addressed later. The reporting obligation is triggered by the statement that the child makes to you, that your player makes, that he's being abused at home. It has to be reported. And it also has to be reported to the Center for Safe Sport. The center may not have jurisdiction over the complaint because if the father isn't a participant, isn't registered, the center may say, sorry, there's nothing we can do about this, but the reporting obligation exists nonetheless. The second example is another situation that we had this year with a club. So a minor age player, a 13 or 14-year-old boy, sent a pornographic meme via text to a group chat. And the recipients on the group chat were a bunch of other teammates, all, his age also, 13, 14-year-old boys, and also parents. So this, I got this complaint from a parent. It came straight to US Soccer, and I reported it to local police and the Center for Safe Sport because the allegations could constitute sexual misconduct for sure, and also possibly child abuse, because even though the person that sent the meme was a child, the recipients were also children, and exposing children to sexually explicit material can be considered child abuse. So it had to be reported to law enforcement. The age of the sender isn't really relevant because the alleged victims here are the recipients of this video. We're all, we're all minor age children, and so I filed a report with the local police. This next one is an example of emotional misconduct that I thought rose to the level of mental child abuse. These are really tricky, but if you're hearing allegations like this, the important thing is to just, kind of go with how you're feeling about the consequences. And like I said, look for allegations about the effect of this bullying or this abuse on the child. I also tell members to just err on the side of making a report. It's much better to make a report. You're a mandatory reporter, and so if you think that you might need to make a report, if I'm not sure, I always err on the side of making it, because we just, as mandatory reporters, never want to be in the position of, having, we should have made a report, but we didn't. So this case was hard though. So I got a call from a parent, and I had a long conversation with this parent who was really concerned about her son's coach. She alleged that he was bullying her son relentlessly, and there were some things that stuck out in our conversation that led me to make the law enforcement report. She first told me that the bullying had gone on for a full playing year, like not just, a couple comments here or there, but like a full season and the season before. She told me that the coach was singling her son out and personally insulting him on an ongoing basis, that he didn't want to go to practice anymore, that he was depressed. She told me that he used to be an A student, now he's a C student. He's having trouble eating, he was having trouble sleeping. She had tried to address this issue with the club and wasn't getting anywhere. So based on all of that information, particularly the effect that this conduct was having upon the player, I did end up reporting it to local police and the Center for Safe Sport. A lot of times when you make a report like this to local authorities, they're not very interested in following up. And really our job is just to make sure that we make a report when it's required. The follow-up in terms of what law enforcement decides to do with the report is sort of out of our hands, and it's sometimes difficult to make these reports. It's sometimes hard to get local police to take a report like this, but you just have to be persistent about explaining that you're required to make a report under the law, and you're just doing your job. I don't see, this might be the only example of mental child abuse that I saw this year. Most of the emotional misconduct allegations that we get are, everything from a poor coaching technique all the way up to a true bullying or, a behavior that needs to be corrected. But I did want to discuss this example because I really did think that in this case, the conduct was so severe and so ongoing, and the child really had a lot of negative consequences as a result. And so I made the report to law enforcement. This last one's pretty easy, but I put it in here because I do sometimes get questions. I'll get, an SRA will email me or a state association and say, hey, I've got these two referees, one, harassed the other one. I don't need to make a report though, right? Because they're both adults. If it's sexual misconduct, if it's sexual harassment that's been alleged, it still needs to be reported to the Center for Safe Sport, even if everybody involved is an adult. If it falls under the sexual misconduct category, it needs to be reported to the center. And this example of, I had a situation with coaching, and then I also had a referee situation between two referees. Like persistent asking out on dates when the person has said, no, I don't want to go out with you. That could constitute sexual harassment, and it should be reported to the center. This is the last part of my presentation, so hopefully we're going to have plenty of time for questions if you have them. Switching over to the map. So the minor athlete abuse prevention policy is a policy that the center requires all of its NGBs to follow, including U.S. Soccer. In 2022, the center is going to extend that jurisdiction of the MAP, as we call it, down to all of its state associations too. So that's sort of a change in the authority, the center's authority. It's an expansion of the center's authority. But the good news, well, you might not think it's good news, but in terms of what practical changes our members will see, our U.S. Soccer's athlete and participant safety policy already requires much of what's required by the MAP is already required by U.S. Soccer's policies. And we impose those requirements on all of our covered organizations, any member who has adults and minors in regular contact with each other. So U.S. Club Soccer, the state association, Say Soccer, AYSO, we already have these policies in place for our members. The policies that are required, you're all probably familiar that our members have to take some sort of abuse prevention or safe sport training on an annual basis. We have a minimum standard of background screening that we require for any adult participant that's going to be in contact with minors. We have rules and procedures limiting one-on-one interactions between adults and minors. And the next slide, that's what I'm going to focus on, is just what that means and what those policies are. And then all of our member organizations have to have a process for enforcing the Safe Sport Act and dealing with allegations of misconduct, a reporting process. So prevention policies. This is a really pared down version, but I wanted to just review the prevention policies that limit one-on-one interactions so that everybody can be aware of the proper practice for this. For meetings, if you're meeting with one-on-one, if there's one adult and one minor and you're having a meeting, it needs to be in an observable and interruptible place. It can't be behind closed doors. If you're going to have a private meeting in a private place, a second adult needs to be present. And let me back up just a minute. So I talked about the importance of reporting. The reporting mechanism is the way that we stop abuse that's happening, or remove a minor from an abusive situation. But these prevention policies are really important because one-on-one interactions are often the precursor to abuse. A potential abuser uses meetings and electronic communications and so forth to groom minor age athletes, and they're sometimes a precursor to abuse. And so having some rules and restrictions on those really can go a long way in preventing the abuse from ever happening, which is really the end goal. Transportation and lodging, these are should be probably pretty familiar to you. We always have emergency circumstances, and there are a couple of other exceptions, but as a general rule, an adult should not be riding alone in a car with a minor that's not his or her child. Another adult should be in the car, or two minor athletes should be in the car if there's just one adult. Parents can give consent. There can be exceptions, but that's a general rule. Non-parent guardian adults should not share hotel rooms with minor athletes, and meetings on the road when you're traveling really should be conducted in open areas and not in hotel rooms. Massages and rub downs, this is more, I don't know how, it depends, I suppose, on the club, but in terms of how often this comes into play. But any massage or rub down should be performed in an open, interruptible location. Again, not behind closed doors if there's only one adult and one minor. And only licensed professionals should perform these services. And even if a coach is a licensed professional, because of the authority, the position of authority of the coach over the player, a coach should not be performing those services to his or her own player, even if they have a license. This last screen is probably the most important one because we all are using electronic communications to communicate with our athletes. And when I say athletes, I'm including minor age referees also are considered participants and considered athletes under our policies. If an adult has to communicate with a minor athlete, there should always be a second adult copied. And if a minor athlete initiates a communication with a coach, like, hey coach, what time does practice start? The adult should copy another adult on the reply. And these These rules are as much for the protection of the adult as they are for the protection of the minor. The whole idea is to make communications between adults and minors transparent, open, discoverable, so that no one's ever in a position, well, you know, the adult isn't in a position of, you know, of being accused of having improper communications. And for the minor athlete, you know, like I mentioned at the beginning of the prevention policies discussion, we're trying to prevent any sort of, you know, grooming behavior or pre-abuse behavior. It's a good policy. Platforms that, you know, you should use only communications platforms that allow for open and transparent communication. Snapchat's not a good idea. I know there are a lot of, you know, my kids club uses, their soccer club uses, I think it's Team Snap. I know there are a lot of platforms that are designed to comply with these rules and that can be used safely to communicate with your teams and your referees. Adults shouldn't maintain private social media connections with their minor athletes. They can, you know, engage via a club page or a team page, but they shouldn't have personal social media connections with athletes that are minors. And this is not required, but as a general rule, it's good to get into the habit. Absent emergencies, of course, the emergencies happen where you find out at 9 p.m. that tomorrow morning's game is canceled. But as a general rule, it's good to plan your communications with your minor athletes, you know, between, we call at US Soccer, we call them soccer hours, between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. If possible, like I said, that's just a recommended policy, not a requirement, but it just helps keep things on a professional level. And it's a good practice to follow. This is the last slide. This is my contact information, my office number, my email. You know, a big part of my job is just helping members navigate these safe sport policies and trying to support members as they deal with complaints. I can help, you know, coach you about how to make a report if you're in a situation where you need to make a report. And I'm always available to help. And you know, over the past year, one thing I've realized, and I said this in my presentation at the AGM, you know, soccer, you know, our members are really on the forefront of safe sport compliance. And, you know, soccer has implemented safety programs for its athletes. It did that way before safe sport required it. And I just really appreciate all of the work and the effort that you put in to keep the sport safe. I know it's extra work, but you know, it's very much appreciated from our end. And you know, I can't thank you enough for all that you're already doing to help our players and our minor age referees stay safe. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, thank you so much, Alison. So we have one question in the chat that I don't want to miss out, and the question is, am I correct to assume players 18 and over playing with 17-year-olds and possible 16-year-olds need to complete the safe sport?
That's a good question, and it's a question we've been getting a lot, and the answer is yes. We actually talked to the center about this because when we were implementing our safe sport program in US Soccer's Development Academy, we asked the center whether a close in age exception could apply, whether players like these 18-year-olds could be accepted from the program, and the center told us no, there's no exception. So anybody that's 18 that's on the same team as any minor age player has to complete safe sport training and has to be screened. But remember, US Soccer screening requirements are, it's in a policy 212-3. You have to check the sex offender registry, the safe sports disciplinary database, US Soccer's risk management list, and your own risk management list. There's no requirement that a third party like official background check be completed, but 18-year-olds should be screened against those disciplinary lists, and they should take safe sport training.
All right, thank you so very much for this answer. Everybody that has a question, please unmute yourself and get
Hi, Allison. I have a question regarding timing on the refresher courses. And I'll just use myself as example. I took the
Sure.
training in 2019. Um, in August, I took a refresher course in July of 2020.
Okay.
And then I didn't even think about it, but I got on at the end of last month and I saw a course. So I took a course.
Yes.
Don't know whether I needed it or not, but I took one.
Yep.
And then a couple days later, I realized I needed to print out a certificate of completion, which I did. And when I did, I noticed that there was another course up there now.
Yep.
Um, and so my question really relates to my understanding is that I have to take one course, one refresher course a year. First of all, is that true? And how about the timing? The fact that I took it in February as opposed to August as I did the year before, does that mean I've taken another one during this year, or is it just once every calendar year?
So it's actually the requirement is once in a 12-month period. So it doesn't, and so the nice thing about that is you can make your cadence whatever you want it to be. It can be a, whatever 12-month segment you want to use, January to December, July to June. You bring up a good point, and this actually came up on my AGM presentation too. The way that the training platform works, and actually we're going to talk to the center about this because it's causing problems. Once you take a course, the next course shows up in your queue about 30 days after you take, if you take refresher one, refresher two will be in there like 30 days after. You don't have to take refresher two until 12 months after you take refresher one. But it shows up, and people that are trying to make sure all their, T's are crossed and their I's are dotted sometimes take the courses when they see them. And that can result in like running out of available courses because the center only releases one course every year. So the answer to your question is you don't have to take another one. Whatever the date on your most recent training certificate, you have until that date next year before you have to take another course. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. That's very
Yeah.
helpful.
And like I said, we're talking to the center. I've heard Greg Fike and I have both had this discussion with several different people, and so we're going to see if the center can quit making the next course available so quickly because it's causing some issues. So we're hoping to get that changed so that maybe you get it, maybe it pops up 30 days before your current training expires or something like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Allison, can you talk about the cycle that'll be coming into play with the recert and the refreshers?
Oh, sure. So the 2022 map. So the way that we now know, I don't know, depending on how far along you all are in your training, the first day sport training you take is core training. It has three parts. And then after you take all three, you're considered safe sport trained. And that's about a 90-minute, the core course is about 90 minutes long. Each year since then, the center has released a refresher course. Refresher 1, Refresher 2, and then just this past fall, the center released Refresher 3. Those are each dealing sort of like emphasizing different topics, and they're all about 30 minutes long each. So this fall, the center will require another core training for anyone who has completed core and refreshers 1 through 3. So in year 5, there will be another core training required. We're not sure if it's going to be retaking the core training that already exists or whether there will be a new core training. But essentially, the center has just announced that the training will be on a 4-year cycle. So you'll have core training in year 1, refreshers in years 2, 3, and 4. And then in year 5, you'll have a longer, likely 90-minute core training. And so the center just announced that that's sort of the training cycle that they're going to use. And that was relatively new information that we learned with the release of the new MAP policy that goes into effect in 2022. Did that answer your? Is that what you? Is that what you wanted me to talk about, Tim?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be a 4-year training cycle.
Anyone else have any questions?
Allison, I have another one relating
Yeah.
to a situation. I was actually a little bit surprised by that bullying example that you used. And so let me give you a scenario that I've dealt with, which I would have never thought was reportable in any way, shape, or form, and get
Mm-hmm.
your opinion on it. I had a parent complain to me that their coach, it was a female soccer player, she was maybe 12, and that their coach was being unduly critical of her, and that she
Mm-hmm.
thought she needed a break from playing soccer. She also complained that the other girls were not nice to her. They realized she was probably the weakest player on the team and refused to pass to her in practice, and otherwise refused to, pick her for games, or would roll their eyes when when she was assigned to their team in a
Mm-hmm.
competitive setting. And so I talked to the coach, worked through some of the issues. The girl did not take any time off. The coach is constructively critical. So when the player doesn't do something the way the coach wants it done, the coach would say, "That's not the way I want it." Think about this. He would use guided development to try to, get the player to do what he wanted her to do. But he was
Mm-hmm.
also very uh, praiseful of her. So when she did something right, he would say, "Hey, good job." That's what I want to see.
Right.
And in fact, the girls, made an assessment that this player was the weakest player on the team, and there was to some extent some exclusion. I would have never in a million years thought that was reportable, and I'm curious what you think based upon the facts that I just
So
told you.
I would agree with you. In my example, I mean, like I said, that might be the only time I made a report when it comes to bullying allegations or emotional misconduct over the past year. The things that really and again, and like I said, it was sort of like, oh, I don't know, maybe not. But for me, that my example was close enough that I didn't want to err on the side of failing to do something that I should do. But this mom told me that that she had to take her child to the doctor. That he was just, I mean, just certain things that she said just gave me an overall feel that, first of all, she had complained multiple times and it just kept getting worse. And there was personal, like, the kind, like, like, hey, team, you want to know why we lost this game? Because of him. That kind of thing, like over and over and over, and personal insults, talking to players on the bench about what he was doing on the field. His grades dropped. He, just there, it was just sort of like the totality of the circumstances. Um, what you're describing seems like more of I mean, it's certainly emotional, could be emotional misconduct, and it could be a safe sport code violation, but not one that necessarily needed to be reported to the center. If you call me about that one, I would probably say, I always defer to the person calling me because only you have all the information, but I would probably tell you in that case that it sounds like bullying. The only other case where I called law enforcement, I had one situation where a coach, again, it was like a 12-year-old boy or maybe an 11-year-old boy, but I had a coach who was constantly making like sexually insulting remarks to a player, sort of like telling him he wasn't really a boy. And, the mom ended up having to take her son to the pediatrician because he was so concerned that somehow he wasn't normal, like for his age. He was making derogatory comments about the boy's physique and things like that. And they were sexually explicit comments. I won't say what they were, but referring to his private parts and making really, really nasty comments like that. And the kid got so upset that the mom had to take him to the doctor. That was another one that I reported. More because it was like sexual misconduct, because the stuff he was saying to the kid was totally sexually inappropriate. It was inappropriate and in of a sexual nature. But that's the only other example I could think of. But what your example sounds, definitely like it needed to be corrected. But I look the sort of the aggravating factors would be, that it just never stops, that it's only this one player, that the insults are personal, like you're so fat or you run like a, like personal insults, not come on, why'd you pass there? Or, even yelling. I mean, everybody, we all yell, right? But a lot of it has to do with the nature of the comments and what the coach is saying. And that it's ongoing, happening all the time, constantly. Those are things to look for. And then just the consequences that it has on the child. And every child is different, but with this mom, like I said, she just said that her son was just a completely different person and had just really, struggled. And so, and I can tell you, law enforcement didn't really follow up there. But I just felt like a report was necessary. Those are the hardest ones to decide, to try and figure out. And so I think it's okay to go with your gut a little bit. And, and like I said, if you're really undecided, I always just make a report because it's the safer way to go. But 95% of those types of complaints that administrators or coaches are going to get, or directors of coaching are going to get, are likely going to fall more into the bullying category, or just like I said, maybe bad coaching strategy, or where you pull a coach aside and say, look, this isn't productive. Like, just be more constructive. Understand that you're talking to an 11-year-old girl. Just that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, this story ended up having a happy ending from the standpoint that the girl ended up really integrating herself into the team and became actually a very popular member of the team. And it was she ended up leaving the team. That's only because her dad took a job in Virginia Beach. And she spoke very highly of her experience, et cetera, et cetera. So,
great.
I mean, the story had a happy ending, but I mean, there was that sort of rough spot there.
Well, and listen, a lot of these a lot of the complaints I get, it's hard. A lot of them are the player involved ranges in age from like 11 to 14, and that's no coincidence. It's a really hard time for kids. It's a really hard time for players. They're really, a lot of them, insecure and underconfident, and so most of the time it's a matter of making a correction or imposing a lighter penalty, like, hey, why don't you take this positive coaches training, or let's particularly if you're hearing it from a lot of different people. And that's why it's great to have the safe sport code and these prohibited conduct policies, because you can head it off at the start and just hopefully make an adjustment before things get worse.
Okay, please don't forget to unmute yourself if you have any questions. All right, I don't hear any further questions. Alison, I do appreciate your time tonight. It was very, very informative. And on that note, thank you everybody for participating. We will catch up with each other next Wednesday for a general update meeting. So for today, the meeting is adjourned, and have a very nice night and stay well and safe. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, everyone. Nice meeting all of you virtually.
Okay, thanks again, Alison.
Thanks, Allison. Thank you.